we have a fair amount of questions in the chat right now. So if you end your presentation, if you stop screen sharing, then we'll see if anybody raises their hand. But in the meantime, we had one question about if you apply phos acid through the irrigation system, would that satisfy your phosphorus requirement? And potassium, because if you buffer the phos acid, if you buffer it with potassium, will that be a way to supply phosphorus and potassium to the tree?
Yes, potentially. I think it would be interesting to have a data set that actually compared how much was getting into the foliage, because the phos acid is supplied mainly as for phytophthora control. I'm sure some of it gets oxidized and distributed to the leaves, but I think we would really need to, I haven't seen data that actually shows what the response is to phos acid and the potassium that's contained in that. But yes, it should contribute somewhat.
Yeah, and we have another question. Someone's asking if you could make a statement how all this data is on Hass, how it would apply to Forte.
Well, I think we have to be careful anytime you go to other varieties and rootstocks and so on. But you know, a lot of our data was actually on non-clonal rootstocks, and so there's a lot of variations built in there. And I think by going across many sites and situations, ways trees were managed, that what we've got now is kind of the big picture. And I would think that probably not too far off on any of the varieties that we're growing, but certainly it's an issue for the future. If again, this is the first step in trying to come up with specific targets for these trees, but we need comparison studies. And if there's a question that comes up, or we start seeing different responses in other types of varieties, that needs to be investigated further. This is not by far. I mean, there's already been 100 years of research on this. What's coming in the next 50 or 100? So I think there's still some things to be done with some good tools.
Okay, so the next question is about the leaf potassium level. We need to ask whether the high levels are the cause for the low productivity, or is it a consequence of low yield and hence low potassium demand?
Chicken and egg. The way I see that data set increasing across there, there's clear thresholds where things are happening. And the whole trend line to me tells me that it's pushing the canopy growth, and the photosynthate's being directed to the canopy instead of to the fruit. My opinion is that it's an excess that's driving canopy growth and alternate bearing and taking trees out of high yielding categories. So I think it's an excess of the nutrient. It's not burning the tree, but it's somehow interrupting the physiology that's going into fruit production.
Okay, so the next question is, can sulfur, zinc, manganese, calcium, magnesium easily be applied through the irrigation system? Is there any evidence that foliar applications are efficient or successful?
Okay, that was my first project, was looking at zinc, and you're best to go with fertigation or soil applications. Fertigation is best for soluble nutrients, but zinc applied foliarly, we showed using radioactive zinc that it stayed right where you put it. It might wash off and then be taken up by the roots, but applying it to the foliage, it painted the leaves with a precipitate of zinc, which you could analyze, but it didn't take care of the fruit. You end up still a small round fruit. So I think, maybe at the right time when the leaves are not fully hardened and they don't have the dense wax coating on them, maybe you might be able to get some trace elements in with the foliar application, but I don't see any advantage over taking a chelated form and putting it into your irrigation water and applying it by fertigation, because it delivers it right to the root system. And under the canopy drip line, that's where you really have your best uptake classically, where you have all the fresh root growth occurring right on the fringe of the tree canopy. And that's where it needs to be applied. Some of these you have to be careful. You certainly don't want to mix calcium and phosphate together because you'll end up with a precipitate and it'll plug up all your emitters. So there are some micronized forms of calcium gypsum, and those have been tested as proprietary products. And I think those are pretty reliable, but be very careful just mixing up things on your own, especially with calcium and phosphate, magnesium and phosphate. You'll end up with a mineral.
Okay, here's the next one. In 1995 CAS yearbook, Benyakov reported on a 10-year study of fertilizing with manure versus ammonium nitrate and found that the manure trees yielded 50% more fruit. Any guess on why that would be?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. The manure provides all kinds of carbon as well. And the root system of an avocado tree is extremely coarse. It's very highly dependent on mycorrhizae, and it would not even be able to grow if it wasn't mycorrhizal. John Menge worked on mycorrhizae for most of his career. And there's long-standing hypotheses about the dependency of trees with coarse root systems on mycorrhizae. Those with finer root systems, weeds and things, tend to have very fine roots. But trees like avocado with very coarse root systems, what they're doing, those roots are mainly just kind of attachment points for the mycorrhizal fungi. And if you've ever seen cobwebs across a field or something, imagine that cobweb underground, and you have hundreds of miles in a single gram of soil. You can have like hundreds of yards of hyphae. They're microscopic in size, but they're extensions of the root system. And that whole network is dependent on having organic matter and aeration and a good moist environment. And the more you promote root health and mycorrhizal formation, the more efficient your nutrient uptake is, especially for phosphorus. So high excesses of nutrients can suppress mycorrhizae, suppress the formation of them and the abundance. So I think having the manure in there with a slow release nitrogen form and promoting a well aerated, moist environment, absolutely, you've created a better root environment for nutrient uptake.
Okay, yeah, someone asked a question whether it was microbial activity in the mulch layer that gave Benyakov his results. You've sort of answered that one.
Yes, in a sense, in addition to the mycorrhizae, there are many, all kinds. This is my favorite area, actually. It's what I studied the most at UC was soil microbiology. And there are many plant growth promoting bacteria that are involved in producing growth hormones that would stimulate root growth. They're involved in production of organic acids that chelate metals, and they provide a slow release of nutrients and phosphatases that solubilize phosphorus. And just every single element is affected in some way by having an abundant and diverse, healthy microflora. When you have low organic matter, you have low biological activity, and everything is pushed more onto the plant itself to try and extract nutrients.
Okay, great. So now we have two questions that are basically very similar. The question is about sulfur. So the question is, can you, how about applying elemental sulfur to the soil? Can you, does that lower the pH and supply the sulfur rather than spending all the money of having a sulfur burner?
Absolutely, yeah. Elemental sulfur is great. I have a bag of it out here. I use it in Kentucky soils on my blueberries, but it takes a while. Elemental sulfur will require, say, 3 months to a year to fully solubilize. And as it solubilizes, it goes from elemental to sulfate, and it's reacting to form sulfuric acid around the sulfur granules. So it will lower the pH, but it won't lower the pH in a calcareous soil until all the lime is gone. If you have a calcareous soil with free lime in it, which is common in Southern California, you have to dissolve all that lime. That lime will buffer the pH at 7.2 to 7.4 or greater, and you won't be able to drop the pH. But putting a large amount of elemental sulfur in one location, there's even been work of digging post-hole digger, putting some elemental sulfur in, or putting it around the fringe of the canopy. And in that surface area where it's affected by this sulfur, elemental sulfur application, you will decrease the pH you'll have greater availability of trace elements. You'll have the accumulation of sulfate. So it's a very inexpensive way to fertilize with sulfur. A bag of sulfur is maybe, I think I spent $7.05 in a nursery. So at larger amounts, it's really an inexpensive, great fertilizer. But in an acid soil, if you apply elemental sulfur, you could end up in trouble. So you certainly don't want to push the pH down to 5 or 5.5. Anything below 6 is you're heading for trouble, especially on dissolving phosphorus. Phosphorus has maximum availability at around pH 6.5. So being a macronutrient, that's kind of where we target the pH to be. And pushing it down a little bit will improve 1 unit will improve the zinc and iron and manganese. But you don't want to take the pH too low with elemental sulfur, and trying to get it back out of the soil is impossible. So be careful if you're dealing with an acid soil and sulfur.
So one question I had sort of on that is sometimes for especially organic growers, you can apply sulfur to control insects. Mm-hmm. So by with the sulfur spray, would that help supply sulfur to the tree?
Sure. Anything that's going on, sulfur is it's recycled pretty heavily in the decomposition process. If you have say 5% organic matter, 10% organic matter, there's so much sulfur coming out of that that it's recycling, it's being taken up. So having the organic matter on the soil and organic matter compost additions is going to almost provide enough sulfur for you right there if you're an organic grower. A little bit of elemental sulfur or sulfur for insect control, all that will contribute because it ends up in sulfate form. But sulfate will also, it's an anion, it leaches readily from the soil. So it does get lost from the system eventually.
Okay, we have sort of a comment here. It's long, so I'll read it to you. Based on my research, the potassium and sodium molecules are almost identical. And if there are elevated levels of sodium, the plant will take those up in place of potassium. Also, I've seen in research that if the sodium and potassium levels combined in the soil are greater than 10% of the total base saturation of cations, mm-hmm. that can be detrimental to plant health and yield. I don't see any of your research here out there. Was that taken into consideration?
There's a lot of work on nutrient interactions. There are potassium and sodium interactions. We have not taken that into account in our particular research. No, we did look at some of these issues in the final report. We had a whole series of diagrams where we looked at every combination of one element against another. So we paired them up, copper against all other 11 elements, sodium against all others, and you can see that there are some interactions, but most of the data points are indicating a rather limited interaction, not enough to completely push things in a different direction. But this is largely due to the shared transporter systems, like chloride requires symport with a proton, and you have sodium potassium transporters, and various elements share the same transport system. So there are some things that I think come into play. Calcium magnesium ratios are also very critical. Typically you want 3 to 1, and that's for various reasons. Magnesium has a smaller hydraulic radius, and so it tends to seal up the soil and cause poor drainage. So having a 3 to 1 calcium to magnesium ratio is important for improving soil drainage, and also is optimal in the plant. And as I learned here with grass tetany, it's even optimal in cows and humans. Having the right calcium to magnesium ratio is essential to maintaining a healthy physiology.
Okay, so we're going to go back to sulfur question here. Okay. Sulfur burners are expensive and high maintenance. Is there another way to apply soil sulfur? So you answered that more or less. Organic growers are using tiger sulfur. After about a year in the soil, it breaks down. Is there merit in this effort?
I'm not familiar with tiger sulfur. Is it a slow release, or has it been?
I don't know. I don't know. But, well, maybe the person who asked that question, yeah. Here's another one. Are you comfortable that your sample size was large enough for establishing representative standards for our industry? Many naysayers in this data.
I think we had the best data set that's been analyzed yet. We ended up with a data set of some 3,000 observations, and we were able to filter out different groups. We took out some of the alternate bearings. We looked at frontier analysis, envelope analysis, quantile regression. We put every single tool we could to find the best way to describe these relationships. There's going to always be noise because you're dealing with field data from different trees and locations. But you could possibly refine these for particular sets of conditions. But for the most part, we now have much better insight into these relationships than we did before. But I'm not saying that it couldn't be improved further.
Yeah,
certainly, in the future, if growers continue to provide their yield data or keep track of their yield data and what's going on with their trees, so we could probably put together even a tighter fit on these models.
Okay, here's the next question. We know that rootstocks can influence the amount and types of nutrients that the tree takes up.
Yeah.
Are there rootstocks that are more suited towards achieving the ideal nutrient concentrations than others for the house?
Well, I'd say the main problem that we saw, and it might just be because I worked on salinity, but the DUSA, the salinity tolerant rootstocks are really better because you have more root growth. They can still produce roots under high salt conditions. Now, that was also a problem though with was it not Toro Canyon? There was
7?
Duke 7, no, it was one that Thomas rootstock had deeper roots and very fast roots, but it ended up taking up too much chloride. It was extremely chloride sensitive, and we didn't have too much of that across our sites, but the one grower that had a larger number of Thomas, we never saw any high yields ever. So it was just chloride sensitive, and it's not satisfactory for producing avocados. I'm sure there are differences, and breeding, this is one of the things that there's a lot of room for improvement in the future. Maybe even breeding programs that look at target alternate bearing. I think that's probably one of the bigger questions than root growth. But yeah, there's still work to be done on these issues.
Well, yeah, I mean, I can tell you that from the rootstock trial that we had at South Coast Field Station in non-root rot conditions, that there was a huge difference in alternate bearing due to rootstock. So definitely, and we saw also that there was differences in leaf analysis based on rootstock.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think that's a valid comment.
It is a valid comment.
So here's another one. Implications on fruit set are critical during the springtime. Can you make any thoughts on your observations? Obviously, pounds are a function of fruit per tree over time, time fruit size.
And so the question?
Implications on fruit set are critical during springtime. Can you make any thoughts on your observations? I think maybe this has to do with the timing of the application. Obviously, pounds are a function of fruit per tree over time.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's very clear that there are optimal times to apply these elements, especially nitrogen. And I think the Lovett study, Salvo and Lovett, really showed clearly that applying it at the right time in June and July was able to take care of the nitrogen demand without causing an increase in the amount that's in the tree, but you got the best fruit yield. And there was, as I recall, no effect on the proportion of small fruit versus commercially valuable fruit. So I think timing is critical, especially with nitrogen, on getting the best yields and the fruit size and everything that you're looking for. But this is this is something that needs also some further follow-up. Is July and August really better? Could you get by with less in another time? Or in why July and August, only 2 applications? Wouldn't you be better off to still deliver it, say, continuously from April through July with a small amount introduced every irrigation? You have to also coordinate it with your leaching program, because as the summer goes on, you're getting more and more salt in the soil. You don't want to flush these nutrients out of the soil. So there's a lot that has to be integrated there, and we have a lot of interactions to consider.
Okay, we got a couple more questions here.
Okay.
Here's one. Dave, you once told me years ago that one of the most important things a grower could do to increase production is to apply a woody mulch to their trees. Do you still believe that that is so? And if so, how much and how often should you apply the woody mulch?
Well, the woody mulch just gives you a little bit more resistance to decomposition, a slower release. You see where the roots are growing in an avocado grove, and everything is concentrated right underneath that mat of litter that's the decomposing leaves on the surface, and the sticks and all the blossoms and things that end up on that soil. Those are relatively easily degraded, are decomposed, and then you end up with nitrogen cycling out of those. But the woody mulch gives you a better overall environment. You're maintaining soil moisture. The roots can escape from some of that chloride that's in the lower soil. They're right there interfaced with all the activity of the biology, liberating the nutrients. And I think having a good mulch layer is pretty critical. A bare soil, you're just looking at pushing your roots down deeper in the soil, because they have to be able to resist the high temperatures, the crusting of the soil. Yes, I'd say mulches are certainly a good treatment.
Okay, here's one. What's your take on adding humic acid to encourage beneficial microbial life in Southern California soils?
If it doesn't cost too much, it's great. Vermiculture, organic methods are very good. Depends on the cost. I wouldn't spend a lot of money, because you can produce humic acid by applying a good mulch. And humic acid, after 4 or 5 years of growth, and you start building up that leaf layer, you reach a steady state where there's a constant release of nutrients that are being recycled from decomposition.
Okay, now we have 3 comments. People are providing information on Tiger Sulfur. So Tiger Sulfur is OMRI approved. It's prilled, so it's easy to spread, but the prill breaks down relatively quickly. And then there's one person here using it on their blueberries, and they provide the website. So I can send you that website before the meeting. I'll copy it and send it to you.
Okay, yeah, prilled sulfur is great. It's much easier to handle and less dusty. You can distribute it with a variety of processes. And so, yeah, I'd say Tiger Sulfur sounds fine.
Okay, here's another one. Since some fruits of avocado varieties ripen at different times, would feeding the trees in July and August still be appropriate? And if I'm using containers, would you recommend using a soil with, quote, black mixed with black sand as an alternative to regular sand? I'm thinking this is phosphorus at a premium.
Phosphorus at a premium. I'm not sure I follow the logic of black sand versus white sand. Black sand would in a container.
Yeah.
I don't know that I can answer that question.
How about the idea that comparing a Reed or a Lamb Hass avocado to a Hass, because they're harvested at a different time. The Reed and the Lamb Hass would be harvested in the late summer.
Yeah, that's definitely a situation that could affect the phenology and the nutrient demand. I think the Salvo-Lovett study showed clearly that there's some loss of yield potential by having the tree have to mobilize those nutrients from the wood and get it to the fruit, there's just maybe a delay, a hysteresis or something, but providing the fertilizer at the right time makes it easier for the tree to set the fruit and to get that early fruit growth. So if you have a tree that is producing fruit on a different phenological cycle, then yes, there's probably an optimal time to match that.
Okay, we've got a couple more questions here. Could you satisfy all the tree nutrient requirements with compost?
Probably, but I think some of the trace elements, see the compost is going to generate organic acids, and that is going to complex your trace elements. So yes, I think that you could do that, but you know, you're going to have different effects of compost depending on, and if you've got a really high calcareous soil, you may need still to lower the pH with sulfur or something in order to get it into the right range where, you know, compost is having the desired effects of mobilizing these elements. But yes, you look at natural systems, and I've seen trees, different locations, California, Portugal, Africa, they're not fertilized at all, and they're 40 feet tall, and they're producing avocados, and people tell you they've been producing avocados every year without ever fertilizer, but they build up a layer of decomposing leaves and organic matter, and animals hang out underneath the trees, and I think trees do fine without intervention by humans as far as, you know, producing some fruit. But to really optimize and get the highest yield potential, there may still be some manipulating that you have to do with some external elements applications.
Okay, so the black that I mentioned was a typo, and it says, so it should be, if I'm using containers, would you recommend using a soil that's mixed with black sand as an alternative to just regular sand? I'm not sure what the black sand, I guess.
I suspect that black sand has manganese in it, because manganese turns real dark. I'm not sure for sure what causes the black color, but desert varnish is all associated with manganese, and I don't know. It'd be interesting to try. I mean, you can always do a leaf analysis and see what the difference is with black sand versus white sand.
Okay,
right off the top, I don't see any particular advantage, because but if manganese is an issue and manganese is in black sand, then possibly there might be some benefit.
Okay, so we're going to go back now to sulfur burners. If burner acidification is not an option, or sulfur can't be incorporated, do other products like humic or fulvic acid help micronutrient uptake if applied before or with the microbes? It is becoming increasingly challenging to hold our pH down with high pH water. We need some product ideas / solutions here to help the microbes get into the plant.
Yeah, the micronutrients have to be complexed with something, and that's what plants will often do. They'll produce citrate. All your dicots and will produce citric acid, which forms a complex and holds it in a soluble form. So other organic acids will do some of that, but citrate acid is probably the best. Humic acid and fulvic acid. Fulvic is more diffusible. It's smaller molecule and more soluble, and it diffuses around. It's produced by in the early stages of decomposition. Later, as the organic matter ages, you end up with more humic materials, and they're larger molecular weight. They will hold it in a form, but it's not diffusible through the soil. So it's kind of like this soluble pool or semi-soluble pool that can be further mobilized. It's easier to dissolve or to strip trace metals off of humic acid than it is, say, to dissolve a mineral form of zinc oxide or iron oxide. That requires pretty harsh acid to actually dissolve. And plants have been dealing with this through evolutionary history. They produce their own chelates. They produce citric acid in response to iron and zinc deficiencies. And you have phytosiderophores that are produced by grasses that enables them to grow in high pH soils. But the chelate industry, there's synthetic chelates that are very effective, EDDHA for iron, DTPA for copper and zinc, citrate, iron citrate works. But yes, I think incorporating some fulvic acid or humic products with your trace metals is a good strategy. You don't have long once you apply a metal to the soil. I mean, you can watch it in the laboratory. It over a period of days, it changes into a mineral form, and it's no longer soluble or available.
Okay, another question here.
Yeah, I'm gonna run my nose.
With many benefits of injecting sulfurous acid, do we have any idea how many gallons per acre would be needed to adjust the soil pH and water pH comparable to what sulfuric or Furic can achieve? Of course, depending on water pH and bicarbonate, say a water of pH 8, would it be reasonable to say we would need 30 ounces per 1,000 gallons of water, roughly 75 to 80 gallons of sulfurous acid per acre per season? I know that's a long question.
Wow. Well, it sounds like that grower is well on track to calibrating the actual sulfurous acid needs. I think there's a lot that comes into that. It depends on the baseline alkalinity of the soil. And if you have 1% lime in your soil, you already have a ton of lime that's there. It has to be it has to be dissolved before the pH will shift back down again. And when you're applying alkaline irrigation water, you're building it up as well. So the amounts of sulfur and sulfurous acid really depends. That's required depends on the baseline alkalinity and irrigation water, and all that's going to be calibrated through probably through lab testing or through the grower's own work with a pH pen, to see what's going on.
Mm-hmm. So I have a question for you. When you mentioned early on in the talk that almost all irrigation water now has some kind of nitrogen in it.
Mm-hmm.
So when you did your study that transects across the industry, did you account for in your calculations the nitrate concentration in the irrigation water?
No, no, we didn't. The amount that you're going to apply in your irrigation water at 10, if you're at the maximum contaminant level of 10 parts per million nitrate nitrogen, that's a relatively small amount compared to the total amount of fertilizer that the growers are applying. But you'd be looking at plus or minus 10 pounds of nitrogen. And in our study, everybody, unless they were on an organic system, was applying nitrogen in much larger quantities. And so we did not take that into account, but I'm not sure that it would really make any difference given the non-responsiveness to nitrogen anyway. Plants only take up what they need on nitrogen. And if you go down below 1.9 and start making nitrogen transporters and the roots become more active in acquiring nitrogen, there's nitrogen sink in the plant because once it enters the plant, it's converted to amino acids and then it's shipped off through the phloem up to the canopy. And if there's no nitrogen demand, then the nitrogen levels get into equilibrium in the roots and that's it. There's no more coming into the plant. It stays in the soil. But nitrogen is really unique in itself on that. I don't think it would be an issue, but no, we didn't consider different levels of nitrogen.
So I have another question for you, because this is based on a project that Ben Faber and I and Jewel Meyer had. So, it was a long, long time ago, where we applied nitrogen at different times of the year and 2, 3, 4 applications, similar to what Carol did, versus applying it as fertigation every time we fertilize.
Mm-hmm.
But the one thing that we were very interested in, because we worked with Lanny Lund as well, was groundwater pollution.
Mm-hmm.
And so one advantage of applying it with the irrigation, whenever you apply the irrigation, is that you get less nitrogen moving down into the groundwater.
Yes.
So this idea that you would only apply 40 pounds in 2 large applications in July and August, you think that's environmentally sound to do?
No, I think it's better than applying 125 pounds. But I think it could be further optimized for sure. If I were doing it, given that anytime you have nitrogen sitting around, it's on its way out of the system. So supplying only what the plant needs when it needs it is the best way to do it. And fertigation is perfect because you put it on, you irrigate another hour after you put it on, so it distributes into the root zone, and then the plants take it up, and another week later you apply it again, and you essentially can inject it into the tree at that fashion without having groundwater contamination. But this is a big topic. The CDFA, I might have mentioned, they had a 229 slide data set where growers, especially the almond growers, are now doing self-assessments, and they're giving classes on nitrogen management and certified self-certifications where you assure that you have a nitrogen management plan. And so you have to account for everything in your irrigation water, your timing, and that you are using good management practices on applying that nitrogen. And I think the state might even come to requiring that, because they're looking at how much is going in and how much is going out. What's the nitrogen removal by a crop, and how much are you applying? And if you're applying levels that don't give you a nitrogen use efficiency of some 30%, then you're going to get in trouble. So I think it's become a critical issue where it needs to be managed to prevent groundwater contamination.
Great. We have 2 more questions now.
Okay.
Are there any isolates of mycorrhiza that are known to form symbiotic relationships with avocados? Are some better than others? And does it make sense to inoculate our trees with these isolates? If yes, where can we get them?
Okay. The mycorrhizae people have been searching for magic bullet for the longest time, and not just endomycorrhizae, but ecto too. And what you find is that almost all plants in nature are already mycorrhizal, and that the mycorrhizae that you find in a particular soil are adapted to that condition, and trying to introduce something from elsewhere does not really help because they just get displaced, they get outcompeted. And many of the species in mycorrhizae are kind of loosely defined. There's Interradices and the Tunicatum and Glomus mossi. There's about half dozen that are used everywhere for studies, and they're available in spores. You grow them up on strawberries and crops. But the only time they're really useful is when you're in a situation where the organic matter has been depleted, like on strip mine sites, new construction, any place that's been been bulldozed, where you have depletion of the mycorrhizal spores, then yes, there's an advantage. And in tree nurseries, I think, where you sterilize the soil and you want to put a tree out that has already got the mycorrhizae on it so it can adapt to the soil, there will be some advantage there. But then over time, they eventually get displaced, and there's a lot of work on that. The native mycorrhizae come in and take over, and they're the ones that predominate. Having a magic mycorrhizal isolate that would confer salinity tolerance would be fantastic. And I've known people and participated in a project where we went down in Chile and looked at some of these salt flats, and these trees or these shrubs are dependent on mycorrhizae to get nutrients in these high salt situations. But transferring that up here on avocado, we could try it, but whether or not it would survive, it's a major research project. So I'll leave it open.
So do you think, do you think that the presence of mycorrhiza do you think there'd be a difference between avocado rootstocks and their ability to establish these relationships? And do you think that would help with salinity?
Good research project.
Okay. Great. We have one more.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, there's been so much work on mycorrhizae. If someone did have the magic bullet, it would be out there. A lot of times when you don't hear something, it's because no one found anything to report. So this becomes increasingly skeptical.
Great. So we got one more question here, and then we're almost to the end of the meeting. Do you recommend chasing the crop size with the potassium thiosulfate applications, say going from 15 gallons per acre to an average crop, to 30 plus as a heavy crop becomes evident? Or just keep the same amount season to season? In other words, does the potassium stick around from season to season?
Potassium is held on the exchange complex. It's held in internal pore spaces of clay. It's the dogma on that is that it's money in the bank. Once you apply it to the soil, it's there for years. But from what I'm seeing, I would really be careful. I would look at the leaf analysis on potassium and see if you really need a potassium application. And I doubt that you need it every year. Your 30 pounds that's removed with the crop, there's a lot of potassium in soil. There's probably a ton of potassium in an acre of soil, under normal conditions. It takes a long time to deplete that and draw it down. So I would be cautious about using potassium on a regular annual basis. I would look at the leaf analysis, look where I'd like to go with it, up or down, and try and do an incremental approach to adjusting the potassium concentrations. At the end of the slide set, I left a few extra slides that I didn't include, but that might be interesting to look at. But
okay, you want to show up?
Well, let's see. Yeah, let me look real quick. This was for nitrogen. I'll share it real quick.
I got a question for you.
Okay.
There was some very nice research done both in South Africa and in Australia, because they're very much more dependent upon export markets. So the fruit are in the post-harvest chain for a long time, showing the negative impact of nitrogen on depressing calcium in the fruit, and reversely negatively impacting the post-harvest quality of the fruit. I mean, and as you may remember, the guy Whitney showed for his master's about this calcium relationship with high nitrogen trees. Do you want to comment on that?
Definitely. We also ran into that where we were looking at let's see, was it the purple water, reclaimed water that had very high amounts of nitrogen, and the fruit quality was awful. The fruit was rotten pretty much before you picked it. And we also studied this with calcium as well. Calcium will help to offset the chloride effects on fruit ripening time. But if you had high chloride and low calcium, as soon as you took the fruit out of storage, it was ripe. So it had no ripening time. It was done. And if you increase the calcium in the fruit, you could tolerate higher levels of chloride and still have a reasonable ripening time. It would take a week or two to fully ripen. So yes, there are some interactions, especially on fruit quality, related not only to nitrogen, but also to calcium and chloride.
Well, yeah, so it's very, I mean, Gary Bender did that first reclaimed water project, and we did post-harvest work on that fruit. And like you said, the fruit just basically fell apart from the reclaimed water treatments. But all reclaimed water are not created equal either.
No, that's right. It can be custom designed.
Yeah. So we have one more question here that just came in. Please discuss potassium at 0.8 to 1.1 compared to the conventional 1.7 still cited by many.
If you're at 1.7, you're potentially losing half your crop. Potassium excess.
Great. So are you going to share your screen?
Well, we can go back to that potassium slide. Share. So which one do you want to look at?
Oh, well, it's up to you. We're right at 10 o'clock. I think people are still listening. So I think if you want to share a little bit, people will stay on.
Well, let's see, the potassium one, 1.8, you're out here. And this 0.81, you're over here. So you're looking at yield potential percent of max. This is all lost yield potential out here. These are all over fertilized at 1.5. So, and there's this chart here, 1.5, you can see the number of high producing trees. You've lost all your high yielding trees, or most of your high yielding trees. You're down to about 5% of them that you had. Is total population out here at 0.8, 0.9, some 20% of your trees are in this high yielding category. And the higher you go, by the time you get out here to 1.5, you can see the ones that are in the zero producing mode, alternate bearing probably, but that are yielding zero fruit, 0 to 10 kilograms per acre, or per tree, I mean. It's approaching 40% of your trees at 1.5. So you've lost the high yielding trees, you've got all these alternate bearing trees there. And the actual yield potential, looking here at the yields, here's the median yield for all the trees in the data set, 50, 60 kilograms per tree. You go out here to 1.5 and you're down here to probably less than half. So you've shut off maybe 60% of your yield potential, or your mean yield that's associated with that level of potassium. Potassium is the one that very clearly there's these statistical indications that these effects occur out here at high potassium. Got to be really careful with potassium. And then there was the machine learning model, again, showing all the high yields associated with 1% potassium, but above that, you start losing yield.
Great, Dave. Does anybody have any other questions that they want to ask? You can either raise your hand or put it in the chat. We'll just give it a few seconds. Do you have some slides at the end?
Oh, I was going to just show you that across on the backside here, this is the leaf chloride versus leaf calcium and the fruit days to ripen. And here you can see it, when you have high leaf chloride, you get up here around 1%, 0.9%. It's 0 fruit days to ripen, and that's at low levels of calcium. Now, as you increase the calcium to 2%, you're out here. It takes 5 or 6 days to ripen. If you have low calcium or high calcium and low leaf chloride, you get 10 days to ripen. So, from fruit quality standpoint, having low leaf calcium and high chloride is a disaster. And then I put in some other things on what other trees are using, and it's pretty similar. I had a little bit on Omri products, but then a decision tree for how you would do nitrogen replacement. You could do this with potassium as well. You look at your yield, how much is removed in your requirement. Now you have to do some adjustments. So what percentage are you looking to target in your leaf? And then this then you multiply times your nitrogen requirement, and then you can look and see other considerations, the type of soil that you have, and come up with N to be applied. This would just sort of be the conceptual basis of what you're trying to do to do an adjustment based on leaf tissue analysis. And here's a little further indication of the same type of thing, looking at N losses, leaching, denitrification, application frequency. And all this ultimately can be used in to determine your fertilizer requirement, and you adjust your schedule. So,
Rafi, oh, thank you. Well, that's
structures. Okay.
Yeah, well, that, yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Mike.
Yeah, Michael Kelly here. I want to ask if you're fully mulched and the mulch is composting down maybe a year or two, is there a beneficial use or not of maybe broad spread cow manure to encourage your bacterial count? Would that be effective, or is it interfered by the mulch thickness? And just as a stimulant, would the cow manure act positively or neutral or negative? Thank you.
Okay. Cow manure is a great source of organic matter. That would work in conjunction with the mulch, but you do have to be careful about salts. Measure the salt level. Composted cow manure would actually be better than any fresh manure materials because they tend to be salty. So be careful with the salt content. There are charts available about the salt content of different manures, but certainly composting them and leaching them will get rid of some of the salts, and then it'll leave you with a product that is useful for your organic methods.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Any other questions? If not, we want to thank you very, very much, Dave, for taking time.
Good.
And thank you, everybody, for attending and staying until the end. And we'll see you in about a month when we have the first session on irrigation.
All
Thank you
right.
very much.
Thanks for being here today and asking.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks, Dave.
Dave.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you very
Good.
much.
I appreciate it. Thanks. Okay, we'll
It was
see you
very,
next
very
time.
interesting.
Presentation. Thanks, Dave.
Bye-bye.
Welcome.
Thanks very much.
My pleasure.